Hi. Um, Sometimes when I make videos, I want to talk about uplifting, nice things. Um, but the truth is, I cover news often, and let's be honest, the news is often not uplifting. It's often serious and depressing, and as we've seen recently from Afghanistan, it's not a pleasant subject. But that is the world that we are in, and it's interesting and there's a lot of talking points around it, but it's not pleasant. Um, so I sometimes wonder, like, should I maybe be a bit more upbeat, maybe cover this story, that story. But the truth is, with issues like Afghanistan, there is so many talking points. Hence, it provides, without wanting to sound flippant about it, it provides material to discuss. Um, so I've made a few videos now on Afghanistan, the fall of Kabul, and the Taliban back in power and so on. But uh, since those videos, there was this atrocity at Kabul Airport. Now, something like this was anticipated, but its scale, even by Afghan standards, is horrendous. Over 90 civilians dead, 13 US military personnel dead, no doubt dozens injured. Horrible, horrible. I mean, this is about as depraved as you can get, targeting desperate people fleeing a war zone, men, women, and children fleeing for their lives, blow them up. In my opinion, it is pure evil. Some people say evil doesn't exist. Everyone has a good bit of good and bad. To me, that is just pure evil. There's no caveat to that. There's no, oh well, maybe they have a bit of good in them. That is pure evil. And there were some graphic images that news sources showed. Incidentally, in journalism, there's always an ethical question, like after a terror attack, do you show the blood and carnage or not? I sort of take the view that you can't totally censor it. I appreciate, for example, you're not going to show on a newspaper cover some horrible image of someone's mangled corpse, but the British press today was showing, for example, some women who had bloodied heads. It was graphic, but it wasn't the most graphic image. It wasn't showing dead bodies or anything like that. So I think that's probably the right approach. Don't censor it to the full extent, but maybe not show the full horror because that's probably what the likes of ISIS want as well. They want to discuss and shock people. But incidentally, it's also, I believe, the deadliest incident for U.S. forces in a decade. 13 troops killed at once. I believe one of them was a Navy personnel. I think they weren't all from the same branch, but 13 killed. This was a major terror attack, and it's horrible, and it probably won't be the last. Apparently, the group responsible is specifically ISIS-K. Now, whether that K stands for Kabul or something else, I don't know, but it seems to be one of these many branches of ISIS that can be found all over the world. Um, Earlier this year, of course, there was the bloodshed in Palmyra in Mozambique, the Cabo Delgado province. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it shows that, I mean, look at that, Mozambique. That's not a great power. It's not a Western country. That to me indicates this is the gravity and the depth of the threat that is faced by Islamist extremism because they don't just target Western countries or Western interests. I mean, this was Mozambique. Um, and the great irony about Islamic extremism is probably most of the victims are Muslims, or certainly most of the victims occur within Muslim lands, within Islamic countries. Um, when an attack occurs in Paris or Brussels or Nice or Orlando, it gets a lot of attention because it's in a Western location. But or Manchester, and the list goes on. But these sort of atrocities happen all the time in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso. You know the the number of people who have died in West Africa this year goes into the many thousands. Nigeria and Burkina Faso, the Central African Republic, Mali. Um, so what happened in Afghanistan is obviously localized to that situation, and it's like the start of a new conflict because if we consider the Afghanistan war technically ended on the 15th of August with the fall of Kabul. If you look at Wikipedia, that's being seen as a cut-off point, but it hasn't ended bloodshed. Um, the line from Biden is this is precisely why we had to get out, but others will take a critical angle of it. The thing with this is history will probably judge Biden in quite a harsh light in terms of some of his public statements and so on. But I also think that time will also determine the Biden legacy in terms of pulling out the way he did, and so publicly. Um, but I want to tap into a wider problem. I've spoken about this before, but so long as I've got breath in my body, I will do so. And that is the wider issue of Islamic extremism. Something I've always found hard to tolerate is dishonesty and moral cowardice. What I mean by that is when you have people who know there's a problem, or they should know there is a problem, and they choose to take the easy step, and this is where the cowardice aspect comes in, easy step of telling people what they want to hear. I mean, if you're a politician in the UK, it's a lot easier to be politically correct than it is to be a bit renegade, or I don't think it isn't even is renegade. It's truthful. Say actually we do have a problem with Islamist extremism. Um, I mean, I think it's striking that when that teacher was threatened in Batley, in West Yorkshire, for international viewers, that's a town near Leeds. This was a British teacher who had to go into hiding because he delivered a lesson on blasphemy. But this wasn't mocking Islam, it was discussing the issue. As far as I know, he is still in hiding because he had death threats to his life. Now, what I'm driving at here is whenever we hear about these attacks by the likes of Boko Haram, ISIS, um, Al Qaeda, and there's other groups, there's always people who will say it's got nothing to do with Islam. They just use Islam, or they're terrorists. That's it. But every terror group has an ideological basis. Every terror group, the IRA did, the FARC did in Colombia. In some cases, it's territorial, it's nationalistic. In the case of Islamist groups, they are religious fundamentalists, and their ideology is in spreading a global caliphate. I mean, this is the thing. To those who want to blame all of this on Western foreign policy, like if the West wasn't involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, then there'd be no Islamic extremism. That doesn't explain why countries like the Philippines have been hard hit by Islamic extremism. Nigeria, these are countries that they didn't have troops in Iraq or Afghanistan, certainly not in any significant numbers. So I believe that, I mean, as Tony Blair rightly said, it was Al Qaeda attacked the United States, not the other way around. That has to be understood. So I believe that Islamic fundamentalism, Islamist extremism, Pan-Islamism, all those terms I think are valid. Um, it's one of the gravest threats facing humanity. I think it's a virus on the world. And I don't think you can compromise with a mindset that is willing to blow people up in order to spread this caliphate. I don't think you can rationally get into that sort of head. I don't believe you can. I'm not saying that there's any easy solutions, but at the very, very least, it has to be understood that there is a problem. But here's the thing: why does it matter when Muslims say, "Oh, Islam is peaceful and tolerant," and non-Muslim apologists also say that? Because I think those non-Muslim apologists, they think they're being progressive, they think they're being enlightened, but in my mind, they're just being used for idiots. Now, why does that matter? It matters because it's fundamentally dishonest. And this is why it's dishonest. It's easy to say that groups like Boko Haram and ISIS, oh, they're just terrorists, they're distorting Islam, they're not true Muslims. Okay, we could even take that argument. How then do you explain that in a country like Pakistan, an alleged blasphemer can be beaten to death? Or, even within legal jurisdiction, they could be put to death. I mean, the people who do that, the people who have that mindset, they're not terrorists. That's mainstream opinion. It's mainstream opinion, and with all due respect to liberal Pakistanis, it's a reality. A country like Pakistan, there are overwhelming conservative attitudes to insulting Islam. So when I hear this line, Islam is peaceful and tolerant, it sure as hell isn't tolerant. A religion that would be tolerant would not be so hypersensitive to perceived insults. It just wouldn't. As for peaceful, well, the what they usually say is, oh, but not every Muslim's a terrorist. Well, of course not. Any reasonable, intelligent person will know that not you can't say 1.6, 1.7 billion people are terrorists. Of course not. The vast majority of Muslims are normal people who are just getting on with their lives. I get that. But what I cannot stomach is the propaganda and this idea that the perceived offense to a religion is more important than challenging the savage human rights abuses and extremism that's done in its name. So if your first reaction to a terrorist attack is to say, oh, but it's got nothing to do with Islam, you're part of the problem. You're not actually addressing the ideology that's there. Say what you want about these terror groups, but they sincerely believe they are true Muslims. So simply saying they aren't, it won't solve the problem. It doesn't. This idea or delegitimizes them. Well, who gets to determine what is true Islam, really? The Quran is full of violent surahs, and the go-to there is, oh, but you're taking it out of context. Well, that's just the problem. The Islamists take the more violent and intolerant bits and they say that's a true Islam. And the more moderate people will say, oh, but that's it's metaphorical, or, well, actually, often in Christian thinking, the more violent, extreme parts of the Old Testament, let's face it, the Old Testament is pretty hellfire and brimstone. Christians will often say, well, that's metaphorical, it shouldn't be taken literally. The problem is, in Islam, many Muslims do take every surah literally. Um, but the point I'm driving at here is it's a major world faith. You're going to have different schools of thought. No one can really claim that they are an expert on Islam. So, when you get people who say, oh, this terrorist isn't a true Muslim. If he was, he would read the Quran. And my response to that would be, okay, but what qualifies you as a true Muslim? So you spent years studying theology. Okay, well maybe you are an expert. But then another expert will say that you don't know what you're talking about. So it will never be solved when you have, and it's the same in Christianity and other major faiths in terms of deeper theology. What is the meaning of this? What's the meaning of that? But I think Islam does have a unique problem in terms of how widespread this fanaticism is. In Hinduism, you have extremes. In Judaism, and Buddhism, in Christianity, even in Sikhism. I say even because it's often seen as peaceful. But every religion has its extremes. It does. But I still argue that Islam is unique in terms of the global spread of this ideology, Pan-Islamist fundamentalism. That is unique. I mean, with Christian fundamentalism, you get certain Southern Baptist groups that are very hardline. You even get a few nutty types who would actually want Old Testament justice. And they tend to be pretty homophobic. And, in the case of Uganda, with Uganda's notorious laws on LGBT rights, that was actually imported by American evangelicals who went there. And but I still say, well, that's a sovereign country. They still made their own laws. But anyway, I digress. Um, if you're a Muslim and you're watching this, if you think, oh, but Nathan, you're misunderstanding Islam. Well, When there is a day that teachers are not living in fear of their lives, then you can tell me Islam's a tolerant faith. Until that day, I'm going to consider that narrative to be propaganda. So it's better to go down the line of many Muslims know this is bad and we abhor that. But the dishonesty of saying that there is no problem with intolerance or violence within Islam is just preposterous. And I think it's cowardly because it's based on this idea of not offending people. Oh, we better not say that, it might offend people, even if it's the truth. I mean, a senior politician in Britain, this is the sad thing. If they were to come out and say we have a problem with Islamic fundamentalism and we cannot go down this line of saying it's got nothing to do with Islam because it does. I'm not saying that should be the focus. I'm not saying the focus should be on tackling Islam the faith, but we have to challenge this falsehood that there's no connection. I would draw an analogy which I think is valid, which is valid. That is the Crusaders. They were Christian fundamentalists, who were inspired by God to spread Christendom in the Holy Land and by the sword. But would anyone rationally say they weren't really Christians? They were. They were Christian knights, and they were men of the sword. They were men of war. They were religious hardliners. They probably had very, very derogatory views on Jews and women, but they were Christians. So this idea that today's Muslim equivalents have nothing to do with Islam, it's just a lie. It's just a travesty. You could argue they're distorting it. You could argue that you don't like their version of Islam. You can't say that ISIS fighters and Taliban and all these other groups, you can't say, oh, they're not really Muslims. Well, what are they? Terrorists, yeah. But what is the ideology? These are just some things to think about. But I don't consider myself a hateful person at all. I don't take any pleasure in a video like this. But so long as this ideology prevails, so long as we have teachers hiding in fear for their lives, it has to be said. Has to be said. Because every time there's an atrocity like what happened in Kabul the other day, you get people saying, "Oh, but don't blame Islam. It's got nothing to do with Islam." That to me is not. It's not really a solution. You have to accept reality. You have to accept that there is an ideological problem of Islamist fundamentalism, is often manifested through violence and intolerance. That is just a reality.